Bom, boa noite. Tá baixo aí atrás? Ou tá bom? Tá bom? Bom, boa noite. Hoje a gente tem aqui conosco o Justin McGuirk. O Justin é autor do livro Radical Cities. Ele também é um escritor e crítico independente baseado em Londres, onde ele escreve para o The Guardian, escreve para Domus. Não está baixo, não? Tá bom mesmo? Tá. E o Justin também é o editor da Strelka Press, que é uma escola em Moscou, uma escola think tank e uma série de outras coisas, e consultora e etc. Bom, então o Justin passou os últimos anos fazendo uma pesquisa extensa na América Latina sobre exemplos de transformações nas nossas cidades e das pessoas que promoveram essas transformações, e ele agora vai compartilhar com a gente esse material que deu origem ao livro. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you, Pedro. Can you hear me? Thank you, Pedro, and thank you to Studio X or Studio X for having me here tonight. Very nice to see you here. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So, this is the first time I'm giving this talk in Latin America, actually, so you might look at me like I'm crazy at some point in this talk, or like I've got it all wrong, and if I have, then I want you to talk to me afterwards, and we can have a discussion. But I first started thinking about this book in 2009, shortly after the financial crash. And I'd been following events in Latin America for several years, and it struck me that there was a group of architects working here who were doing profoundly meaningful work with a kind of social conscience. And I had this idea that it would be really interesting to come to Latin America and start to document the work of these architects. I had in mind that I was calling them activist architects, and I was going to write a book about architecture. And when I came here, it kind of became a bigger story than that, really. It became about cities. And it occurred to me very quickly when I began my research that Latin America has a long history of testing radical ideas in city making. Can we see? Can we see that okay? Okay. Oh. Maybe a tiny bit. Yeah. Yeah, that's better. Okay, so today everybody's talking about urbanization, and they're talking about a kind of mass urbanization in China and India and Africa, and everybody quotes scary statistics about the number of the kind of hundreds of millions of people moving to cities every year, and everybody quotes this cliche that the world is 50% urbanized, but in Latin America, many of these countries are 80% urbanized, as you know. And in the mid-20th century, those scary statistics were coming out of Latin America. Latin America was experiencing in the mid-20th century a pace of urbanization that had never been seen before. And so it stands to reason that there are clear lessons to be drawn from that experience 50 years ago, 70 years ago. And so the book starts here in Mexico City at a housing estate called Tlatelolco, right in the middle of Mexico City. And Mexico City itself was a prime example of this phenomenon. It was a city which in 1940 had 1 million people, but was on its way to becoming 15 million by 1980. And the way of handling that at the time was this. It was a housing estate designed by Mario Pani in the early 1960s, and it was designed for 100,000 people. And the thing about this is that if you compare it to the equivalent projects that were happening in Europe at the time, it's on a completely different scale. So when we think about the model of this, we think about Le Corbusier and the Ville radieuse and so on. But in fact, nothing on the scale of what he imagined was ever built in Europe. Le Corbusier's own projects were very small. And Ville radieuse was never built. So in a way, the first time that idea got tested on an urban scale was in Latin America, in places like this. You could say that it was happening in the Soviet Union at the same time, but I would say that it was different, much more technocratic, much less about architecture, actually. This was very much about architecture with a capital A. So my conclusion was that Latin America is where this Corbusian idea of the city gets taken to its logical conclusion, or maybe even it gets taken to its absurd conclusion, which is that you just build row upon row of housing blocks. It's also, my argument is also that Latin America is where the modernist idea of utopia comes to die. Because the problem with things like this, as much as I feel nostalgic now for things like this, is that governments simply couldn't build them fast enough or cheap enough to cope with the pace of urbanization. And in the end, they decided not to. One of the reasons why they decided not to do it was because by the 1970s, by the late 1970s, there was a new political and economic consensus coming down out of America, the Washington Consensus, led by the World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Federation. And they said, let the free market deal with this. You're going to bankrupt your governments if you try and do this. Just let the free market do it. And so the result of that is that architects were replaced by economists and by policymakers. The role of the architect in the city was reduced and replaced, and a kind of laissez-faire policies took over. And the result of those laissez-faire policies was this. As we now know only too well, after 30 years or 40 years of letting the market deal with housing the poor, what you get is deeply segregated cities. This is Caracas. And what we're looking at here is probably the largest slum in the world. So this, to me, is the challenge of the 21st century. This is the result of removing architects from the question of how to house the world's urban poor. But when architecture re-engages in the early 21st century, it comes at this problem with a very different set of strategies. And that's what this book is about, a very different set of strategies for dealing with urban segregation, urban inequality. And it's really a shift from what I thought was utopian idealism to something much more sensitive, something much more pragmatic. And in a way I was right, but in a way I was also naive, because what I was calling kind of utopian idealism wasn't really that utopian, actually. And I discovered that in Buenos Aires, when I started my research very early on, in a place in the south of Buenos Aires called Piedra Buena. It's a housing estate designed in the 1970s, late 70s, by Solsona and other people. But the architect in charge of it, actually, the very young project manager of this estate, was a young architect called Rafael Vignoli, who's now probably the most successful, commercially successful Latin American architect in the world, and is currently finishing one of the ugliest skyscrapers in London. He's now based in New York, not building social housing anymore. In a way, he's the perfect example of what happened to architects of that generation, just the shift from social housing to glass and steel skyscrapers for speculation. And the problem with stuff like this, is not the architecture. It was actually very good architecture in many ways. But of course, it had all the problems of urban planning at that time, which is that it was dislocated on the edge of the city. It was built for the poor, but it wasn't it didn't end up housing the poor. It gets used to house the unions and the military and the army, to buy votes, to secure the power of a dictator. It was built by a dictator. Most of the biggest social housing projects in Latin America were built by dictators. The other problem with these things, which still happens today, is that there were tools for corruption, for driving the economy, to feed money to the construction companies. They weren't managed, they weren't maintained, it's falling to pieces. They become ghettos. That was the problem, they became ghettos. I'm not talking about the architecture here, I'm talking about everything around it. So I said to myself, if this top-down, paternalistic plan of building social housing didn't quite work the way we wanted it to, and if this bottom-up kind of planning, lack of planning, results in a slum, is there anything else? Is there anything that's is there a model of bottom-up city-making that doesn't result in a slum? And I found one, actually, very early on, up in the north of Argentina, created by an amazing woman called Milagro Sala, this lady here, who is a Cola Indian. This is up on the border of Bolivia in northern Argentina, in Jujuy. And I'd heard about her in Buenos Aires. I'd heard about this woman who was building housing for the poor, and she was building them swimming pools and all these things, and I thought, this sounds really kind of amazing. I want to go up and see it. And she is an incredible character. But when I got there, I found that it wasn't like she was building a few tiny swimming pools for people. She was building really, these huge kind of water parks and like aquatic parks, peopled with animals and things. It was a real kind of fantasy world, very strange. And the amazing thing about this strategy is that a swimming pool is a very cheap way of making poor people feel rich. And the other thing is that, the equation of social housing is normally that the government or whoever is trying to give as many people as possible the minimum that they can get away with. And I found in Jujuy this strategy where she was trying to give people the absolute maximum that she could give them. And that included, theme parks with dinosaurs and playgrounds, sports pitches everywhere. It was a kind of, they call it a country club. It's a kind of theme park, country club. But the amazing thing is that this is a kind of radical socialist movement, a people's movement in the north. So what she did is she took some government money and she did something very smart. I mean, normally when the housing companies take government money in Argentina, they might build a building, they might not build a building. There's a lot of corruption. She took the money, she created factories that make brickwork and steelwork. She employed the community themselves to build their own houses, and then when the community is built, she gives the people the houses. So it's an incredible model, really, of participative community building. And it reverses the equation of what social housing provides. It provides employment, and it provides leisure. It's a real sense of community. The problem with a lot of these housing estates from the 50s is that they didn't really become strong communities, some of them. And every house is branded, it's kind of people at work. Every house is branded with an image of Che Guevara or Eva Perón. It's a strange place where kind of radical socialism is still alive and branded on the houses. And it's like a kind of radical socialist Disney theme park urbanism. And I'm arguing that it's kind of exceptional, not because of all those things, but because it's a successful community, a very pleasant community that doesn't rely on property values, which is it's not about money and property values, which is what most of today's, housing is about. And so it exists outside the market in a strange way, and that's exceptional. We need to create more opportunities like this that exist outside the market somehow, because the market doesn't protect people. It's just a small example, but a kind of powerful one. But the history of participative urbanism is long and well studied. And the character who's really influential in my book is a guy called John Turner, who in the 1960s was really one of the first people to defend slum building and to defend communities who were creating their own homes and to argue that this is probably, in fact, the most viable form of city making that you can have. He was focusing on Lima in Peru, and this is the cover of a 1963 edition of Architectural Design, which was very influential. And what he said was that basically he had this idea that housing is a verb. Housing is not a thing, it's an action. And that is that housing is what it does for you. It's not how it looks, but it's what it does for you. It keeps you near your place of work. It expands when you need to expand for your family. It offers you kind of a sense of ownership, a sense of pride. It does many things. You know, that this is, the conventional view was that this was a slum. And his view was that, well, you can say what you like about it. Maybe it doesn't look good to you, but it's extremely useful as a device for keeping, you know, working class people in the city, empowering them, etc. And the other thing is, he noticed that, you know, these are very low-rise buildings, and but very, you know, they were low-rise but very dense, instead of this kind of modernist idea that you had to go high to achieve density. And so his ideas became influential, and they particularly influenced a housing competition that happened in Lima in the late 1960s, led by the president of Peru, who was an architect. And it was called Previ. And the Previ competition was kind of amazing because it included many of the most famous avant-garde architects of the day, of the late 60s. It was a kind of Olympics of housing. It included James Stirling from Britain, Aldo van Eyck from Holland, Christopher Alexander from America, the Metabolists from Japan, Candilis Josic Woods from Europe. An incredible array of talent. And they were told to develop a housing model along these lines, low-rise but dense. And really the reason why it's important is because it was the last time that the greatest architects in the world turned their attention to social housing. This is one of the houses which was, originally all the houses were single story, one story. This was one designed by the Indian architect Charles Correa. And what this represented, this competition really was, in a sense, it was the last chance for architecture to prove that it could handle the problems facing the contemporary city. And it was totally forgotten. This is the great lost project of modernism, in a way. It was kind of in Lima, and Lima was disconnected from the world. They were going to have this. They had this competition. They were trying to pick one house that could be rolled out in thousands, but they had so many good entries that they couldn't actually pick a winner. So they decided to build all of them, and they created this incredible community in the north of Lima, which now looks like this. All of the houses kind of expanded in strange ways. This is James Stirling's housing. Everything that was one story became 2 stories, 3 stories, 4 stories. Some of it's very easy to recognize, like the James Stirling. Some of it is just nothing like it was in the beginning. The original houses were like the kernel inside the popcorn. They just kind of exploded. I think this is Aldo van Eyck, this one. And it becomes a kind of, 30 years later, 40 years later, it becomes a kind of suburban bourgeois model of a rich person's house, really. It's an incredible, it looks funny to us, but it's also kind of amazing. And the other thing to say about it is that the place is rather amazing. It's very diverse. It's a very pleasant neighborhood to walk around. There are no cars inside it. It's a walkable, dense, rich community, not rich financially, but kind of rich socially community. But it was seen as a failure at the time because it was very expensive, because they didn't manage to come up with the model that they could roll out industrially and so on. And a military government, the military dictatorship came in and cancelled it, and it was forgotten about. But I would say that, like I said, it's the great lost project. Charles Jenks, the British architectural historian, says that the blowing up of this housing estate in America called Pruitt-Igoe in 1972 is the end of modernism. And in a strange way, I would say that this, a couple of years earlier, is arguably also the end of modernism, because it's like modernism was about to evolve into something else. It was changing. It was modernism learning to adapt, and it just didn't happen. It didn't work. Although I think it's an incredible neighborhood. And then 40 years later, long after this was forgotten about, by the general public or by anyone in architecture, the idea was rediscovered in Chile by a practice called Elemental and an architect called Alejandro Aravena. And I know you're all probably very familiar with this project in Iquique in the north of Chile, which is a very extreme model of housing, a very extreme kind of equation of housing. And it's a kind of brutal logic. If you don't have enough money to build someone a house, build them half a house. And it's now a kind of famous example. And so what Aravena did was he built these kind of concrete cores. He builds the half that people can't build themselves, the structure, the bathroom, the kitchen, and so on, and then leaves a void for them to expand into when they have the money or when they have the time. And it's an interesting example, very similar to Previ, except it expands horizontally instead of vertically. It's interesting because it really pushes a lot of buttons that seem important to us today, like citizen participation. It's adaptable. It triggers many of those words that we associate with the new ideology coming out of Silicon Valley. Housing as a platform. Everything's a platform nowadays. Our phones are platforms. Everything's kind of curated by us, adapted by us, etc., etc. And this is along a very similar logic, and it is a kind of amazing idea. When I was there, I found myself, this has been written about a lot, and there's been a lot of kind of very positive critiques of it by people who've never been there. But I do think it's amazing, but I found myself asking, is it too pragmatic? In other words, if you're poor and the government's building you half a house, do you really want to spend your weekends and your evenings finishing the house and expanding the house, or would you prefer to have a whole house? I mean, it's a genuine question. It was not possible at the time to have a whole house, so it's hypothetical. But I asked Aravena this, and he said, he makes a very good argument for it. It does allow people to keep some kind of control over their lives. In particular, it looks like this when people start to expand. Modernism kind of favela chic, modernism favela. And what's interesting about it is it's very unpredictable. You can never tell what kind of idiom is going to appear on the street, and in that sense, it's kind of interesting. I also think, it's never been tested at scale, so we don't know yet if it has many of the same problems that modernism had in terms of a kind of monoculture or a duoculture in this case. But it's interesting, and it's been successful where it was tested. The problem is that Chile became too rich for this solution anyway, because the housing budget kept doubling. And so in the end, they started looking like these houses, with no voids. And, originally they were supposed to have a void inside. People would add their own floor, but they had so much money they didn't need to do that. And Aravena was kind of annoyed by this. He felt that he liked the idea that the residents' participation is manifested on the facade, that you can see it. And I found myself saying, well, if I was them, I would prefer this, because it's like a whole house. But, that's a debate to be had. Anyway, I'm going to move on from Chile, because straight after seeing this, that was the first time I started to study Rio. And I discovered that Rio has a kind of important place in the history of slum upgrading, is what they call it. And this is Alemão, which you all know, and there's the cable car, which may or may not be a success. It seems to so far not be a huge success, but maybe I'm out of date now. That was last year. People were suggesting that maybe it was being underused. I'm not going to talk too much about Rio, because I think you know this place better than I do. But I will make a couple of points about why I think Rio is important in my argument and my journey across the continent. Primarily because Rio is the birthplace of the favela, and the favela is a fundamentally radical idea of how a city can be and how it can grow. And every time when I was researching this book and people kept saying, oh, you're going to talk about Brasilia, I said, no, I'm not going to talk about Brasilia, because Brasilia is in many people's minds the kind of quintessential radical idea of a city, modernist kind of planning from the air. And I would argue that actually the favela is much more radical, much more transformative, and that the favela has been, for all its problems, the favela has been a tremendous device for absorbing populations and for offering them the opportunities that the city has to offer. That's not to say that they are, a success story on their own without support, etc. They need support, but they are a mechanism for providing millions of people with access to the city. And Rio is important because, I talk about many case studies of favela studying and favela creation, but Rio is important because it kind of marks a major U-turn in urban policy that happened in the 90s with the Favela Bairro program. Traditionally, for a good 30 or 40 years, the favela was seen as a kind of problem, as a kind of pre-city, as a state of city that hadn't yet become city, as something that had to be erased and replaced, as something that had to be modernized. And it was only in the mid-1990s in Rio that they decided that actually it's a fact on the ground that has grown so large that it cannot be treated as anything other than what it is, and it must be treated as a functioning, meaningful part of the city. Therefore, it's time to engage with the favela and not pretend that it's some kind of illegal terrain, some kind of damned piece of earth that needs to be dealt with sometime in the future by some different government that's not us. And that policy, that kind of major shift in perception was manifested partly through this Favela Bairro program, where they went in and they started to insert little moments of public space and other infrastructure. And the reason why this was important is because if there's one thing that needs to be achieved, I would argue, it's the integration of the informal city into the city as a whole. That we need to dissolve these barriers that divide these two parts of the city: psychological barriers, physical barriers, social barriers. And one way of doing that was by creating moments of connection between the favela and the formal city, places where you might get social mixing, places that create civic pride, places that add a sense of urbanity to a place that many people assumed was just kind of chaos and crime and poverty. And they did that with things like, with gestures like this. Quite small gestures. I'd say that the transition is really from a kind of modernist idea of tabula rasa, of cutting out the cancer of the slum, to another medical metaphor, which is urban acupuncture, and the idea that you stimulate the system with little meaningful moments of change. I do agree with that, but I don't think urban acupuncture is successful in isolation. You can't do one of these and say, we did some urban acupuncture. You need to really create a network, a system that really changes the whole behavior of the area. Now, I think that, and we'll discover later, that was quite influential to other countries, not just in Rio. Rio was really a pioneer of this kind of urban strategy. That's why I think Rio is important. It was in the 90s and 2000s, early 2000s, Rio was really leading the way in terms of slum upgrading and slum incorporation. And I would argue that Rio completely lost its way as soon as it won the World Cup and the Olympics, because money got diverted. Basically, plans got taken over by politicians and businessmen and construction companies. The whole kind of corruption bandwagon started rolling, and it's unfortunate because there were incredible programs in the works, programs like Morar Carioca, which was supposed to happen. The problem with Favela Bairro was that it focused on urban space and didn't really address housing. Morar Carioca was supposed to address the housing question and improve the quality of housing in the favelas. It never happened. Many explanations why it didn't happen, but let's just say it never happened, and partly because of a lot of just attention being diverted by the Olympics. And one of the key figures in the Favela Bairro program was Jorge Mario Jauregui, or Jauregui, I guess you say here. And I was kind of fascinated by him, and he did a lot of good work. He's done a lot of great work in Rio, And one of his plans was here more recently in Manguinhos, one of the worst favelas in terms of crime and so on, poverty. And he actually drew a great plan. It was a very good idea about how to reconnect this favela to the city. You lift up the tracks and so on, and you create points of access. You build parks and everything. And I'm only showing this picture because it shows what can happen when you can have a good plan, but if the political process doesn't work, if the bureaucracy doesn't work, it just becomes a war zone like this when they partially demolish the buildings and they leave people in a state of total limbo simply for bureaucratic reasons that are just too boring to go into right now, or that I haven't got the time to go into. And, it's a kind of political fiasco, not an architectural fiasco. And, you know this story very well. I mean, these are wonderful photographs by Telma Villa-Boas, by the way. And you just, you go around and you spray a number on someone's door, and that's it, goodbye. And I'm only showing this as an example of how I think Rio lost its way, and you know this very well anyway, and it's not for me to lecture you about it at all. I mean, I found tremendous encouragement from the protests that happened last year because everybody knows what's going on, and I think Rio is important because it's a city that's kind of fighting for the soul of what a city is. And these are the kind of most politicized World Cup and Olympics for many years, probably since Mexico '68. And I would argue that we really need to rethink what these mega sporting events are for. Like, what role do they play in a city? Is it okay for FIFA to come and make $2 billion out of your city, out of your country, and not leave, some kind of social legacy behind? I think, we know the answer to that question. And that's why I'm going to move on to another city where they also had protests earlier this year, Caracas, returning to this image of social division, social segregation. I call this the largest slum in the world. I think it is. It's debatable, but it's called Petare. And Caracas is a divided city, a dysfunctional city. But it's also a city where strange things happen. They had their own Mexico City moment in the 50s, earlier with their own dictator, when they built this, 23 de Enero, the modernist idea of super blocks in open space, an incredibly ambitious project, also failed for political reasons. And what happens in Caracas is it just becomes the bones of a huge favela that gets kind of filled out with the flesh of a favela. And, in a way, I would say this is also radical. This is also a radical idea of city making because it's a hybrid. Latin America, I found throughout my book, produces hybrids everywhere. The formal and the informal kind of get together and produce something that never existed before. And 23, I'm not going to talk about it. It's just an interesting example of one of those. What I am going to talk about is Urban Think Tank, an architecture practice based in Caracas, who did very important work in the early 2000s and continue to in Caracas, although it's difficult. Again, along the lines of the urban acupuncture motif, this is one of their vertical gyms, where you take a barrio which has a football pitch. It's a very simple strategy. On that football pitch, the people of the community, they want a roof over the football pitch so that when it rains, they can play football. Instead of giving them a roof, you give them 4 stories of program and football pitch on the top as well, on the roof. And it becomes a total community resource. And, used 24 hours a day, etc. And the result of things like this is very empirical. Crime drops by 30%, or it did drop by 30% straight away in the first year in this neighborhood. That's a very kind of impactful figure. It's a very kind of galvanizing idea. I mean, more importantly, they've built a series of these, though. Like, not one, but there's now 7, I think, of these, or at least 6 that are finished or finishing. And that's urban acupuncture, but I would say that this idea of connecting the informal and formal city happens more impressively with the cable car that they built to San Agustin. I think cable cars, again, Latin America has this tendency to displace typologies. So we think of them as being for skiing resorts, and you turn them into a typology for slums. And they are a mixed blessing. I think there are successful ones and less successful ones. In Rio, you have a couple of debatable ones. This one was very successful because there's no really decent road that takes you up there, And so, it used to take an hour. Right down here is pretty much the city center. And it used to take an hour to walk up that hill, or even an hour and a half for some people to the top. And now it takes like 7 to 15 minutes, And that's a life-changing fact, especially if you need to get to a hospital or something. So this, for me, is the greatest urban legacy of the Chavez government. And it comes with kind of socialist branding as well, socialist advertising. And the urban think tank for me kind of epitomized this idea of the researchers that become activist architects. Now, what is this thing I'm calling an activist architect? Well, it is an architect as a kind of social connector, an architect who doesn't wait for a client to call them up and offer them a project, or who enters a competition to try and win a project, but they go into a community that they understand, that they have studied, where they know people, where they ask people what they need, and they talk to the community, and they start to find ways of trying to create the necessary change that can transform that community. And that's exactly how this cable car happened. They create the conditions to intervene. And I'm only showing this picture of Alfredo Brienberg from Urban Think Tank because it just kind of illustrates that idea of engaging with the community, that you have to kind of, in a way, get yourself accepted as one of them. You have to kind of understand them, that the days of telling people what's good for them in slums and favelas are over. It's about asking, it's about inclusion. I mean, at this point, I just sound like an advert for kind of a social architecture that we all, I think, now understand needs to happen. But also in Caracas, one of the kind of more extreme examples in my book is this. Torre David, which probably many of you know because it became a cause célèbre in the last couple of years. And in 2012, I spent a week in and out of this building trying to understand it. And what it is a corporate skyscraper, a 45-story skyscraper built in the 1990s that was supposed to be a financial headquarters that was never finished because the developer died. And it stood empty for 10 years, and then in 2007 it started to be squatted, and then became home to between 3,000 and 5,000 squatters. So it was the tallest squat in the world. That's not, to me, the reason why it's so interesting. I mean, I think it's particularly interesting because of where it is. It's in the city center, right in the heart of the financial district. It's interesting because of what it was supposed to be, a corporate, banking headquarters. So a kind of symbol of finance politics, a financial speculation that went wrong. And I think what's interesting about what happened to it is that it's a kind of redistribution of wealth, in a way. I mean, why should people living... when 2 million people live in the slums around Caracas, and there's 2 million people without decent standard of living, why should they live like that when there are 45 stories of empty space right in the heart of the city? And they clearly were asking themselves the very same question because they took it over. And the thing is that this could only happen in a way in Caracas. I mean, this was encouraged by the Chavez government, this kind of demagogic politics that said, take the symbols of private property, especially the unused ones. He never made it legal. He never made it law. That would be really problematic. But he did kind of encourage them to do it, and they did it. This is the kind of round atrium that it would have been the kind of gilded corporate atrium for the bankers that became a meeting space for the community where they made all their community decisions. I mean, I think that Torre David is almost more interesting as a social phenomenon than as an architectural phenomenon, because what's interesting about it is the self-organization that brought a dead skeleton to life. The fact that they brought in electricity, which they paid for, they brought in water, they brought in systems to allocate homes and organize their lives and everything. It's a form of participatory self-management. The only problem with Torre David is that there's no elevator, and it's 45 stories high. And again, Latin America creates a new typology, because the only reason the skyscraper exists is because of the invention of the elevator. And here we have a skyscraper with no elevator, therefore it shouldn't exist and should not be inhabitable, but it is. People live up to the 28th floor, which means walking up and down 28 flights of steps every day, which is a fairly extreme form of urban living. This is an interior which I think is interesting because, what this shows, favela dwelling or slum dwelling is really a question of risk. It starts off you start off with cardboard and newspaper and so on, and then at some point you have to decide: do I take a risk to stay? Do I invest in the future, or do I live precariously? Here's someone who invested in the future and started to create his own vision of a kind of middle class bourgeois existence in the suburbs, but it's in Torre David. The gym on the 28th floor. It's not ideal. I mean, that drop is 28 stories high. It's not a great place for children. So all the time, I'm kind of arguing that this is a necessary process. That this is an interesting urban laboratory. At the same time, I cannot romanticize it. This is a dangerous place for kids. It's not ideal. Many people in Venezuela say it's a place of crime. It's not. That's not true. I mean, yes, in the beginning there was some crime, but that's just a myth. Anyway, I would say this is an accident and an important urban experiment. It's also an important case study for what we might do in the future if all these speculative towers that we're building now just to make money, if that property bubble bursts and you have millions of people living in poverty on the suburbs, can you rehabilitate those buildings? This is the first case study of that. And the experiment is now over because the government has now started the process of evicting the population. They said that they'd sold the building to the Chinese to become a financial headquarters again. I'm not sure if that's true because there have been many statements subsequently that contradict that idea. It's basically just chaos, but they have started to evict the population. But what's important to me about this tower is that it was a symbol. It's this kind of symbolic importance. It was a symbol of finance capitalism that became a symbol of kind of social capital. And it's just a shame that they've evicted these people because there might have been a different future where they made this a kind of genuinely viable option, but it seems that financial capitalism wins in the end. On a slightly more positive note, I want to talk about Antanas Mokas, who was twice the mayor of Bogota in the late 90s. And he's a fascinating character. I just think he's an incredible genius and has tremendous relevance to anyone interested in urban politics and urban planning because he had this amazing ability to change things without really building anything. And he was a philosophy professor, and he became famous overnight when he was faced with an auditorium full of students one day, and they were being really noisy and they wouldn't stop, they wouldn't listen. And so he went to the end of the stage and he pulled his trousers down and he showed them his ass. And it was a huge scandal. They fired him. He went on national TV. But he became a kind of public figure. And he started, the more he talked, the more people kind of wanted to hear what he had to say. Eventually he ran for mayor. He won the elections with a landslide victory. And he started to change Bogota, which had in the 90s many of the problems that Latin American cities still have today, which is problems of segregation, crime, privatizing of public space, and so on. And he changed this with really radical policies by basically, most mayors, they want to build things and they want to cut ribbons. And Antanas Mokas didn't have the money in the civic coffers to build anything, but he did change things, and he changed them by kind of intervening in the kind of civic DNA of the population, by basically playing with their minds. And famously, he did things like he replaced the traffic police with mime artists. And the reason he did that was because nobody trusted the traffic police anyway. Nobody respected them. They were totally corrupt. So why should the population listen to corrupt authority figures? Why should they obey the law if these are just corrupt authority figures? And so he kind of, everything he did, and a lot of it was like political performance really, was about changing the way people think about the city. He did things like he printed like 350,000 red cards, like the ones that referees use at football matches, and he gave them to drivers so that every time they saw someone driving badly or selfishly, he would show them the red card. And like this, what he's arguing is that citizens are more ashamed to be embarrassed by their fellow citizens than they are to be embarrassed by a clown or by a police officer. Anyway, I mean, this is a kind of political aesthetics. He took guns and he melted them into spoons and all of this. And basically, the murder rate fell by 70%, traffic fatalities fell by 50%, water usage fell by 40%. He raised tax revenues by 3 times, partly by persuading the rich to pay more. And he created the groundwork for people who are much more famous, like Enrique Peñalosa, to build many of the urban, the famous transport systems that he built later. And Marcus always said, if you can't change the hardware, change the software. And I think this is a really important lesson, that he was able to, without leaving much of a tangible legacy, he was able to change the city by changing citizens' behavior. And his example became highly influential in Medellin, the second city of Colombia, which is much more famous and famous to all of you architects in the room, because it started producing these incredible civic spaces and public buildings, and they transformed Medellin in the early 2000s, which in the 90s had been the murder capital of the world, with the wars with the drug cartels and Pablo Escobar. I mean, the city was literally just drowning in blood until a civic movement rose up, and they, with another professor, a mathematics professor, Sergio Fajardo, as their leader, they came to power, and they started to transform the city with new public spaces, like this one, and an orchid canopy in the botanical gardens. And Medellin invents this term called social urbanism, which is really an alliance between the citizens and the business community in Caracas and the politicians. And instead of talking about activist architects, I'm talking about activist politicians, people who can change things from the top down in communication with the people themselves. It's really a kind of two-way communication between the planners and the poorest citizens. And one of the ways that they fund this project is through this extraordinary example of the city energy company, EPM, which I didn't really know that municipal energy companies existed, but they have one, so it's not all private business. And it contributes $450 million a year to the city. And they started to use this money to transform the city because they felt that building beautiful buildings and public spaces would change people's perception of the city, would restore civic pride. And it wasn't just about architecture, it was also about the kind of social process, the sense of people being involved and seeing the city change. And often it happened in conjunction with education. So a lot of these spaces were education spaces. Libraries like this one, the España Library Park in Santo Domingo, and schools and so on. And again, Latin America produces another hybrid, not a park, not a library, but a library park. Both things, kind of education and leisure coming together to produce important public spaces. Medellin, of course, also builds a cable car, the first cable car, which is still probably the most successful cable car of all of these ones that they've built, is because it's connected to the main transport system. And they did a survey in Medellin not so long ago, and they asked, would you rather lose your cable car or your mobile phone? And they said, we'd rather lose our mobile phone, which is an amazing testament to the success of that piece of transport. But there's been a lot of, this building is very widely published. You know it. It's designed by Mazzanti architects. And, people have their opinions about it, whatever. The thing is, one is very critical of iconic architecture these days. It's become almost a kind of cliche to criticize iconic architecture. But in this case, I would say the iconicness of it is precisely the point. It's what makes it important. I don't care whether anybody thinks it's good architecture or not, but the fact that it draws attention to the poorest part of the city is hugely important, because these are places that were basically invisible to half the population of Medellin. They would never go there. They would never go near it. They just kind of pretended it didn't exist. And by putting the crown jewel of the city in the poorest part of the city, you completely change the perception of that place. And I think that is one of the key strategies that the world can learn from Latin America, is these kind of things. Putting the most beautiful buildings and public spaces in the poorest spaces. And also strange inventions, another new Latin American typology, which is the escalator going up the slum hillside. We associate escalators with airports and shopping malls, and here it is, connecting a favela to the formal city. Another urban experiment. Finally, all of these lessons kind of start to bubble up. By the way, this journey has been going north, I don't know if you noticed, and it ends in the far north, furthermost north point of Latin America, at Tijuana, at the border of America and the developing world meeting the first world, at this border which arguably runs right around the world and divides the northern economies from the southern economies, which is a border that Teddy Cruz, an architect in San Diego, calls the political equator. So what we're looking at here is the political equator running into the sea to stop Mexicans going into San Diego. And Tijuana is a kind of fascinating place because, as I say, it's kind of where the lessons of Latin America start to filter across that border. And then, the question is, can they influence the urban policies of the world's richest country? And I mentioned Teddy Cruz a second ago, and he is kind of the expert on this area, and he's been studying it for years. And here is a kind of classic example of what I'm going to talk about, which is the wall, which is right there behind this road, which is artificially built to just reinforce the wall. And this is Mexico, and that's America. And what we have in Mexico, right up against the wall, is a slum in the Los Laureles Canyon. And on the other side is a nature reserve. And what you get is all the rainwater running through, flooding this area, and then running through a gully there and taking all the rubbish into the water reserve. So, of course, the Americans are annoyed that all the rubbish is ending up in the water reserve. And the question is, can somehow this ecosystem cooperate across borders? Is there a way of making a kind of American-Mexican cooperation that lets the slum dwellers protect the watershed area and vice versa? Now, it starts with Teddy's observation that these communities in Tijuana are 100% productive. They're not consumer communities. They're not necessarily consuming things. They're taking the recycled rubbish from San Diego and building communities with them. So these are these are garage doors from San Diego that become houses. These are tires from San Diego that get used to kind of bolster the valley walls. Sometimes whole tract houses from America get taken on the back of trucks across the border, and they just pile them they pile them above other houses. And this is what Teddy Cruz calls club sandwich urbanism. And Teddy, in fact, worked on a project where he got the local maquiladoras to manufacture these frames so that these space frames, so that people could quite easily locate the houses on top, when there wasn't enough land. What's the point of these what's the point I'm trying to make with these kind of examples? Why is this interesting? I think because throughout the kind of undercurrent of everything I've talked about today, there is a sense that actually the strategies and the practices of the informal city have a value in almost anywhere, and these are incredibly productive places. They're very dense. They're full of millions of people. But the key lesson from Teddy Cruz, I think, is when he says we need a new concept of density. Density is still measured as a number of things, units per acre. Why not measure it as a number of social and economic exchanges per acre? And that's what he found in Tijuana, and that's what you would find in any, probably, favela in Rio, is a very dense set of social and economic exchanges, not just a dense number of houses. And I think this is a very powerful lesson, actually, of the informal city, that complexity and loose regulation are productive. If you cross that border that I showed you into San Diego, you see the exact opposite. You see houses, it's probably the most expensive property in America, in fact. And you see houses, everything's separated from each other, house from each other, behind a big white fence. Work is separated from life, from living, and that's the kind of model of the first world. But actually what he's saying is, what can we contaminate that model with a more productive one taken from the slums? And he started to do that in San Diego with these designs where you take a tiny plot of land, and instead of saying this is going to have 4 houses on it, you really pack that land full of markets, cultural center, houses for rent, houses for ownership, houses for old people, and you just create this incredibly productive little zone of urban community. And he's starting. This is interesting because you start to get bits of Latin America influencing each other. I didn't mention that Rio and the Favela Bairro was very influential to the people in Medellin, which might be interesting to you, that they took inspiration from the Favela Bairro program. Similarly, Teddy took inspiration from Antanas Mockus and brought Mockus to Tijuana, and now they're working together on trying to make this project happen, trying to make a transnational cooperation between these two cities, San Diego and Tijuana. And so what you have is a Latin American architect, Teddy's from Guatemala, who is very steeped in the lessons of Latin American urbanism, working with Antanas Mockus in San Diego. And this seems to me the very beginning of something filtering up out of Latin America. And I think there are many lessons in the things that I talked about today that are applicable across the global south and even into the first world economies. And that is kind of the point of the book. That is the lesson of the book. And I leave it at this kind of moment full of potential. And that's really it. I mean, that is the message of the book, that these are the radical cities. They're not necessarily the tidy cities that we know from America and Europe, but they are full of potential. And the cities that I mentioned earlier, the countries I mentioned earlier experiencing mass urbanization today, whether it's India or China or Africa, have a tremendous amount to learn from Latin America, but so does America and so does Europe. So I'm going to leave it like that. Thank you very much.